When the millionaire was about to say yes at his wedding, a little boy entered the church with a cassette tape and asked everyone to stop the wedding. When the recording started, all the guests were terrified. The afternoon sun bathed the bustling streets of Florida as Richard Coleman crossed the lobby of his most luxurious hotel. His hurried steps echoed across the marble floor, reflecting the urgency that consumed him at that moment. At 55 years old, with carefully combed grey hair and an impeccable suit, he carried the bearing of someone accustomed to success. But his brown eyes revealed a kindness that money had failed to corrupt over the years. "Mr. Coleman, the documents for tomorrow's meeting," his assistant called, running after him with a folder in hand. Richard briefly paused, turning with a gentle smile. "Leave them on my desk, Carmela. I need to sort out some wedding details now." "Margaret is waiting for me to choose the final arrangements for the ceremony," he replied, adjusting his tie as he walked toward the revolving door. The nervousness in his voice was evident, not about the wedding itself, but about the possibility of disappointing his fiancée, 30 years his junior, who showed extraordinary dedication to his business. Sitting behind the wheel of his luxury car, Richard couldn't contain his anxiety. His thoughts oscillated between the happiness of the upcoming marriage and the responsibilities that awaited him. His phone rang once more, and Margaret's photo illuminated the screen, her radiant beauty contrasting with the urgent message about the floral arrangements. "Just a few more details and we'll be married," he murmured to himself as his fingers slid across the device's screen, responding to the message. The shrill sound of screams and horns invaded his ears before he could even process what was happening. When his eyes left the phone and returned to the street, it was as if time slowed down dramatically. A small figure was running across the road, emerging from between parked cars. Richard felt his blood run cold, his reflexes working desperately to avoid the inevitable. The sound of screeching tires on the asphalt mingled with his own scream of terror. "My God, no!" his voice echoed inside the vehicle as he frantically stepped on the brakes. The impact, though minimized by the abrupt braking, was enough to hurl the small body a few meters ahead. Richard felt as if his heart had stopped along with the car. His hands were shaking violently as he opened the door, stumbling on his own feet in his haste to reach the child lying on the asphalt. Time seemed to freeze as he knelt beside the motionless body. It was a boy no older than 10 years old, wearing simple, worn clothes. His small face was bruised, and a trickle of blood ran down his forehead. "Someone call an ambulance!" Richard shouted, his voice choked with despair. The crowd that was starting to form around them murmured words of concern and accusation, but he could barely hear them. His eyes were fixed on the unconscious little face, while his trembling hands feared touching the boy and causing further harm. With his heart pounding in his chest, Richard made a quick decision. He couldn't wait for the ambulance. Every second seemed an eternity as he watched the child's shallow breathing. With utmost care, he took the small body in his arms, surprised by how light it was. "Hold on, little one," he whispered, running back to his car. The phone, forgotten on the passenger seat, still displayed the unfinished message to Margaret. Richard ignored it, carefully placing the child in the back seat. The city streets blurred as he drove toward the nearest hospital, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. The rearview mirror reflected the boy's pale face, and each time Richard looked back, he felt a new wave of guilt and fear wash over his body. "Please be okay. Please," he repeated like a mantra, his voice trembling with every word. When he finally reached the hospital's emergency entrance, Richard barely waited for the car to stop before jumping out. "I need help!" His cry echoed through the parking lot as he ran to the rear door. With the same care as before, he picked up the boy in his arms, noting with horror that he looked even paler than before. The medical team was already rushing towards him with a stretcher, responding to his desperate shouts. "What happened?" one of the nurses asked, helping him place the boy on the stretcher. Richard felt the words catch in his throat before he could answer. I hit him. I was distracted by my phone, and he came out of nowhere. Please, save him. I'll do anything, pay any amount, but don't let him die." His last words came out in an anguished whisper as he watched the medical team take the child inside the hospital, leaving him standing there alone with his overwhelming guilt. The emergency corridor seemed endless as Richard paced back and forth, his hands still trembling as he ran them through his graying hair repeatedly. The characteristic hospital smell mingled with the aroma of his expensive cologne, creating a combination that only heightened his nausea. Each time the double doors opened, his heart leaped, hoping for news about the boy. Guilt consumed him like a slow poison, corroding his conscience with every second that passed. "Mr. Coleman," a nurse called, approaching with a clipboard in hand, "we need some information about the boy." Richard felt his stomach sink even further as he realized he knew absolutely nothing about the child he had hit. "I don't know him," he replied, his voice failing. "It was an accident. He came running out between the cars and I was distracted by my phone." The confession came out as a tortured whisper, and the nurse's expression visibly hardened. "You were on your phone while driving?" she asked, her professional tone barely disguising her disapproval. "The cell phone in your pocket vibrated again, probably Margaret trying to understand where you were. The same device that had caused all that tragedy now seemed to weigh a ton." Richard ignored it, focusing his thoughts on the child fighting for his life beyond those doors. "Yes, I was," he admitted, feeling the weight of his irresponsibility. "And now an innocent child is paying for my mistake. Please tell me he'll be okay." The nurse made some notes on her clipboard before answering. "The doctors are doing everything possible. As soon as we have news, you will be informed." The hours dragged on like decades. Richard had sat in one of the waiting room chairs, his crumpled suit and loose tie reflecting his state of mind. The cell phone kept vibrating periodically, but he couldn't muster the strength to answer. How could he explain to his fiancée that he had put a child's life at risk because of a message about wedding flowers? The irony of the situation was too cruel to bear. A middle-aged doctor finally emerged from the double doors, his eyes searching the hallway until they found Richard. "Mr. Coleman," he called, approaching with firm steps. Richard jumped up, his heart beating so hard it seemed to want to escape his chest. "How is he, doctor? Please tell me he's alive." The doctor adjusted his glasses before answering, his face maintaining a neutral expression that only increased Richard's anxiety. "The boy is alive but still unconscious. He suffered a head trauma that concerns us. We'll need to do more tests to determine the extent of the damage." The doctor's words hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. "Damage?" he repeated, his voice trembling. "What kind of damage?" The doctor sighed, consulting his clipboard. "It's too early to say. The head impact was significant. There may be neurological sequelae, but we'll only know when he wakes up. If he wakes up." The last sentence hung in the air like a dark cloud, causing Richard to stagger to the nearest wall for support. The cell phone vibrated once more in his pocket, and this time Richard took it with trembling hands. 20 missed calls from Margaret, dozens of unread messages. Her smiling photo on the screen now seemed to belong to another life, a life where he hadn't possibly destroyed an innocent child's future because of his own irresponsibility. "Doctor," he called, putting the device away again, "do whatever it takes, any treatment, any specialist, no matter the cost. I'll pay for everything." The doctor nodded gravely, but his gaze now carried a different weight. "Mr. Coleman, money can pay for treatments, but it can't guarantee recovery. The boy is very small and the trauma was severe. We have to prepare for all possibilities." Richard felt his legs weaken, and he had to lean against the wall to avoid falling. The reality of his actions was beginning to weigh even more heavily on his shoulders. A child might never wake up, or wake up with permanent consequences, all because he couldn't wait to respond to a message about flowers. The hospital corridor now seemed suffocating, the white walls closing in around him like a prison. Richard loosened his tie even more, feeling difficulty breathing. The doctor kept talking about tests and procedures, but the words barely made sense in his ears. All he could think about was the pale little face of the boy, how small and fragile he had looked in his arms when he carried him to the car. "Can I see him?" he interrupted, his voice almost unrecognizable from being so hoarse. "Please, I need to see how he is." The doctor hesitated for a moment before nodding affirmatively. "You can see him, but only for a few minutes. He's in the intensive care area, and we need to monitor him constantly." Richard followed the doctor through the double doors, his heart beating faster with every step. The hallway seemed like an endless tunnel, the fluorescent lights creating shadows that danced on the white walls, like silent ghosts witnessing his guilt. Upon entering the room, Richard felt his heart tighten even more. The boy looked even smaller and more fragile lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines and monitors that beeped in a constant and frightening rhythm. His head was bandaged, and various tubes and wires connected to his tiny body. "My God," Richard whispered, slowly approaching the bed. The pallor of the childish face contrasted violently with the bruises that were beginning to form, each mark a silent accusation against his negligence. "The next few hours will be crucial," the doctor explained, checking the monitors. "The head trauma caused significant swelling, and we need to watch for increased intracranial pressure." Richard could barely process the doctor's words, his eyes fixed on the boy's small injured hands. He noticed the dirty nails, the worn clothes, the old shoes, signs of a difficult life that was now even more complicated because of him. "Doctor," he called, his voice choked, "can you see any identification? Any clue as to who he is or where he came from?" The doctor shook his head, consulting his clipboard again. "We didn't find any documents with him. His clothes have no labels, and there's nothing that can help us identify him. We've already notified the authorities, and they're checking if there are any reports of a missing child matching his description." Richard felt a new wave of guilt hit him. Not only had he possibly caused irreparable harm to the boy, but now he discovered that he was alone, with no one to hold his hand or cry for him. The cell phone vibrated in his pocket again, and this time Richard grabbed it with a different determination. It was time to face the consequences of his actions, but before he could answer, something caught his attention. One of the monitors began emitting a different sound, higher pitched and more insistent. The doctor immediately moved, his eyes quickly scanning the numbers and graphs on the screen. "The pressure is rising," he said, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "Nurse," he called, raising his voice. Everything happened so fast after that. A team of nurses burst into the room, moving with unsettling precision around the bed. Richard was pushed back, watching helplessly as the professionals worked. The voices blended in his ears, medical terms he didn't understand, turning into a terrifying buzz. "Pressure rising. We need to stabilize him. Prepare the operating room." Each word was like a stab in his chest. "Mr. Coleman, you need to leave now." A nurse grabbed him by the arm, guiding him toward the door. Richard resisted, his eyes fixed on the chaotic scene before him. "No, please, I need to stay. I need to know if he'll be okay." But his protests were ignored, and soon he found himself back in the hallway, the double doors closing in his face. Through the small glass pane in the door, he could see the frantic movement of the medical team, preparing the boy to be rushed into surgery. The cell phone continued to vibrate in his hand, Margaret's smiling photo now seeming a cruel irony. How could he think about marriage when he had possibly destroyed a life? The flowers, the arrangements, all the details that had seemed so important a few hours ago now revealed themselves as insignificant in the face of the possibility of having caused irreparable harm to an innocent child. Richard leaned against the wall, feeling his legs weaken under the weight of his guilt. The hours dragged on like decades in the hospital hallway, as Richard Coleman remained seated in the same uncomfortable chair since the doctors had taken the boy into surgery. His rumpled suit and discarded tie beside him were silent witnesses to the hours of anguish he had endured. The first rays of sunlight were already beginning to penetrate the hospital windows, making the deep circles under his eyes and disheveled grey hair from running his hands through it in nervous gestures all the more evident. "Mr. Coleman?" called a nurse, approaching with soft steps. "You need to eat something. You've been here for over 12 hours. Richard merely shook his head, his eyes fixed on the doors where the doctors would eventually appear. How could he think about eating when a child was fighting for his life because of him? His stomach twisted, but not from hunger. It was the weight of guilt consuming him from the inside. "I can't leave here," he replied, his voice hoarse from so much time in silence. "I need to know how he is." The hospital's activity began to increase with the start of the new day. Doctors and nurses rushed by, some casting curious glances at the obviously wealthy man who remained seated in the same spot, like a statue of worry and regret. Richard had lost count of how many times his cell phone had vibrated during the night. Margaret, his fiancée, must have been desperate with his sudden disappearance, but he couldn't gather the strength to explain what had happened. How could he tell her that he had almost killed a child because of a message about wedding flowers? The minutes turned into torturous hours, each second marked by the merciless ticking of the clock on the wall. Richard watched the comings and goings of the healthcare professionals, trying to decipher any news about the boy from their expressions. His hands trembled slightly as he finally stood up to walk down the hallway, trying to alleviate the tension in his aching muscles. It was then that he noticed a small group of doctors conversing in hushed tones near the operating room, their serious expressions making his heart race even faster. The doctor who had attended to the boy the night before separated from the group and walked towards him. Richard felt his legs weaken, needing to lean against the wall to stay upright. The doctor's expression was neutral, professional, making it impossible to guess whether he brought good or bad news. "Mr. Coleman," he began, adjusting his glasses. "The surgery was completed a few hours ago. We were able to control the cerebral swelling and stabilize the intracranial pressure." The relief Richard felt was so intense that his legs almost gave out. He needed to sit down again, his trembling hands wiping a handkerchief across his sweaty brow. "Will he survive?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded slightly, but his expression remained serious. "Yes, he will survive. The trauma was significant, but less severe than we initially feared. However, we need to wait for him to wake up to assess if there was any permanent neurological damage." The word "permanent" hit Richard like a punch in the gut. The possibility of having caused irreversible damage to that innocent child made his head spin. "Can I see him?" he asked, standing up again with difficulty. The doctor consulted his clipboard before answering. "He's in recovery now. As soon as he's transferred to a room, we'll allow visitors. It should happen in the next few hours." Richard nodded mechanically, sitting back down. The next few hours would be yet another eternity of waiting and guilt. The hospital corridors continued their incessant movement, but Richard barely noticed. His thoughts were fixed on the unknown boy he had hit, on how his life had changed completely in a matter of seconds. The weight of the cell phone in his pocket seemed to increase with every minute, constantly reminding him of his irresponsibility. "Please," he muttered to himself, "let me have a chance to fix this." The sunlight now streamed in strongly through the windows, marking the beginning of a new day that promised to be as anguishing as the night he had endured. The afternoon was already advancing when a nurse finally appeared, with the news Richard had been waiting for so desperately. "The boy woke up," she said, her face softening as she saw the instant relief that washed over the man's tired features. He's a bit confused, as expected, but responded well to the initial tests." Richard felt his heart race, a mixture of anxiety and fear taking over his body as he followed the nurse down the hospital corridors. At the door to the room, Richard hesitated. Through the glass he could see the boy sitting on the bed, looking even smaller and more fragile under the hospital's fluorescent lighting. The bandages on his head had been changed, and his skin was less pale than before, but there was still something profoundly vulnerable about his figure. "He's scared," the nurse explained in a low voice. "He doesn't remember exactly what happened and he's very quiet. Maybe you can help him feel safer." With cautious steps, Richard entered the room. The boy immediately turned his face in his direction, his large brown eyes revealing a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Hello," Richard said softly, approaching the bed. "My name is Richard. I'm the person who was driving the car." His voice faltered on the last part, the guilt still heavy on his chest. The boy continued to stare at him in silence, his small hands clutching the hospital sheet. "Can you tell me your name?" Richard asked, sitting down in the chair beside the bed. The boy hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for an escape route. Finally, in a voice so low it could barely be heard, he replied, "Michael." Richard felt a lump in his throat upon hearing the weak, frightened voice. "Michael," he repeated gently, "that's a very nice name. You must be scared, aren't you? But I want you to know you're safe here." The following minutes were filled with a tense silence, broken only by the steady beeping of the monitors. Richard watched the boy closely, noticing the signs of neglect in his appearance, the worn clothes folded on a chair, the unevenly trimmed hair, the thinness evident even under the hospital gown. "Michael," he began again, "can you tell me where you live? Your parents must be very worried." It was then that he saw something shift in the boy's eyes, a moment of sheer panic that made his heart clench. "I don't have parents," Michael replied, his voice trembling slightly. I ran away from the shelter. The words came out as a frightened whisper, and Richard could see tears forming in the boy's eyes. "Why did you run away, Michael?" he asked gently, resisting the urge to grip the small, trembling hand on the sheet. The boy lowered his gaze, 2 tears escaping and rolling down his bruised cheeks. "Because it's bad there," he answered, his voice choked. "There's never enough food, and it gets really cold at night, and sometimes they lock us in the dark basement when we do something wrong." Richard felt a wave of anger rising in his chest upon hearing those words. The idea of children being mistreated, going hungry and cold, was unbearable. His own problem, the accident, the guilt, seemed to pale in comparison to the suffering this little boy had endured. "Michael," he said, his voice taking on a determined tone, "you're not going back there, I promise." The boy looked up. Surprise and distrust mingled in his gaze. "But where will I go?" he asked, the fear evident in his voice. Richard straightened up in his chair, a decision forming in his mind. He couldn't undo what he had done, the accident that had almost cost this child his life. But perhaps he could make amends, not only for his mistake, but also for the injustice Michael had suffered. "You can come with me," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions in his chest. "I have a big house with empty rooms and a cook who makes the best desserts in town. You can stay there until we find a safe, loving place for you." Michael's eyes widened at Richard's offer, a mixture of hope and distrust shining in his gaze. The boy seemed to be waging an internal battle, his fingers still nervously clutching the hospital sheet. You won't give me back to the shelter?" he asked, his voice trembling with the obvious fear of being returned to that place. Richard felt his heart clench at the terror in the child's eyes and made a silent promise to himself that he would do everything in his power to protect him. The doctor entered the room at that moment, interrupting their conversation. His eyes scanned the various monitors before turning to Michael with a gentle smile. "I see our little patient is recovering well," he remarked, making some notes on his clipboard. "The tests show the trauma is subsiding as expected, and there are no signs of permanent damage." Richard let out a deep sigh of relief, feeling as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "When will he be able to be discharged, doctor?" he asked, eager to get Michael out of this hospital environment that was clearly making him anxious. "We need to keep him under observation for a few more hours," the doctor replied. "But if everything continues to go well, he can go home later today." He paused, his gaze turning more serious. "However, there is the legal matter to be resolved. As the boy is a minor under state custody, we need to notify the proper authorities." Richard felt Michael tense up in the bed at those words and quickly intervened. "Doctor, may I speak with you in private?" The 2 men stepped outside, leaving a visibly anxious Michael behind. In the hallway, Richard spoke in a low but firm voice. "I'll take responsibility for Michael. I have the means and resources to care for him, and more importantly, I can ensure he has a safe and healthy environment." The doctor adjusted his glasses, studying Richard's determined face. "Mr. Coleman, I understand your concern and your willingness to help, but there are legal procedures that need to be followed. The boy was in the custody of an institution, even though he ran away from there." Richard ran his hand through his graying hair, his mind working quickly. "What if I get temporary authorization? I have influential friends. I can get my lawyers on it immediately." When they returned to the room, they found Michael sitting on the edge of the bed, his little legs swinging nervously. He raised his fearful eyes to Richard, who hurried to reassure him. "It's all right, Michael. You're coming with me." The smile that lit up the boy's face was like a ray of sunshine after a storm, completely transforming his frightened expression. The doctor, after a few more exams and recommendations, finally gave his approval for hospital discharge, on the condition that Richard followed all necessary legal procedures. The following hours were filled with a series of phone calls and paperwork. Richard activated his legal team, who worked quickly to secure temporary emergency custody, considering the special circumstances of the case. Meanwhile, he arranged new clothes for Michael, as his old ones were soiled and torn from the accident. When the time finally came to leave the hospital, the boy looked different, clean, in new clothes, and a cautious glimmer of hope in his eyes. At the hospital exit, Richard held Michael's small hand, feeling the enormous responsibility he had assumed. His driver was already waiting with the car, and he could see the boy's curious look at the luxurious vehicle. "Ready to go home?" Richard asked gently. Michael nodded, squeezing his hand a little tighter. That's when Richard's cell phone vibrated in his pocket again. It was Margaret once more. He looked at the screen for a moment, knowing he would need to explain everything to her soon, but now his priority was to ensure Michael felt safe. As they walked towards the car, Richard couldn't help but think about how his life had changed completely in less than 24 hours. From a businessman concerned with the preparations for his wedding, he had now become responsible for a frightened and vulnerable child. What he didn't know yet was that the decision to protect Michael would trigger a series of events that would not only change his life, but also reveal secrets that some would prefer to keep buried forever. Hours later, Margaret paced the luxurious rooms of the mansion with restless steps, her high heels echoing against the marble floor. At 25, her beauty was as impressive as her ambition. Long black hair framed a face with delicate features, and her elegant dress accentuated a figure that turned heads wherever she went. However, at that moment, her normally controlled expression was consumed by irritation. Richard was more than 12 hours late, and she couldn't reach him in any way. Where has he gotten himself into? She muttered to herself, checking her cell phone once again. The dozens of unanswered messages and calls seemed to mock her. The floral arrangements needed to be approved, the catering awaited confirmation of the menu, and various other details of the wedding remained pending. Margaret approached the window, observing the perfectly manicured gardens of the mansion. In a few days, that space would be transformed into the setting for the wedding that would definitively put her in control of an empire. Everything needs to be perfect, she whispered, her fingers drumming nervously on the glass. The shrill ring of her cell phone made her jump, but it wasn't Richard. The name flashing on the screen was Elaine, the accountant from the shelter. Margaret felt an unpleasant chill run down her spine as she answered the call. "What is it now?" she asked, not bothering to hide the irritation in her voice. On the other end of the line, the accountant's nervous voice trembled. "Mrs. Margaret, we have a serious problem. One of the children ran away from the shelter last night." Margaret felt her blood run cold, but kept her voice firm. "How did he run away? Shouldn't you be watching those pests?" The accountant continued, her voice growing increasingly anxious. "It's Michael, ma'am, that troublemaker boy. He managed to escape during the staff shift change." Margaret closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to control the panic that was beginning to set in her chest. Michael was too smart for his own good, always asking inconvenient questions, always watching everything with those big, distrustful eyes. "Find that brat," she ordered, her voice taking on an icy tone. "I don't care how, but find him before he causes trouble." Elaine tried to argue about the need to involve the authorities, but Margaret cut her off abruptly. "Don't even think about it. Handle it internally. Use the shelter employees, offer a reward, do whatever it takes, but keep this discreet." After hanging up the phone, Margaret walked over to the bar in the living room and poured herself a generous drink. Her hands trembled slightly as she brought the glass to her lips. Not now, she thought. Not when I'm so close. The wedding would be in a few days, and nothing could interfere with her plans. The sound of a car arriving pulled her out of her dark thoughts. Through the window, she saw Richard's vehicle entering through the gates of the mansion. "Finally," she murmured, quickly adjusting her dress and hair. The irritation over his delay was momentarily forgotten. There were more urgent matters to resolve, and she needed to keep her mask of a devoted, concerned bride perfectly in place. Margaret walked towards the main door, rehearsing the expression of loving concern she would use to question the groom's disappearance. The noise of the door opening made Margaret quicken her steps down the hallway. She already had the words of gentle reprimand she had planned on her lips, but they died in her throat when she saw who was accompanying Richard. There, holding her fiancé's hand, was Michael, the same Michael who had run away from the shelter, the same boy who could destroy everything she had so carefully built. Her eyes met the child's, who recognized her immediately. Margaret felt the world spinning around her, the walls of the mansion seeming to close in on her. The glass she was still holding slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The last thing Margaret saw before everything went dark was Michael's frightened look and Richard's worried expression. Her legs gave way, and she felt her body falling while her mind screamed in panic. Her meticulously constructed plan was about to crumble, just as her body now collapsed into her disoriented fiancé's arms. "Margaret!" was the last thing she heard, before darkness enveloped her completely. Richard barely had time to process what was happening when he saw Margaret collapse. With quick reflexes, he managed to catch her before she hit the floor covered in shards of glass. The expensive perfume she always wore now mingled with the strong smell of spilled drink, creating a disturbing contrast with the deathly pallor that was taking over her face. "Margaret! Margaret, can you hear me?" he called, gently tapping her face, but she remained completely motionless in his arms. "Help! Someone call the governess!" Richard shouted, his voice echoing through the mansion's hallways. Michael remained paralyzed near the door, his wide eyes fixed on the scene before him. The governess, Senora Rosa, a middle-aged lady who had worked in the house for years, came running when she heard the screams. "Good heavens, what happened to the girl?" she exclaimed, bringing her hands to her face when she saw Margaret unconscious. Richard, still holding his fiancée, tried to remain calm. "She fainted as soon as we came in. Senora Rosa, please take care of Michael while I take Margaret to the hospital." The scene that followed was pure chaos. While Richard tried to lift Margaret off the floor without hurting her on the scattered shards of glass, Senora Rosa hesitantly approached Michael. The boy, however, seemed to be in another world, his gaze fixed on Margaret as if he were seeing a ghost. "Come, dear," the governess called gently, extending her hand to him. "Let's go to the kitchen while Mr. Richard takes care of Mrs. Margaret." Michael took a step back, as if the governess's touch could burn him, but eventually gave in when Richard cast a pleading look in his direction. With Margaret in his arms, Richard felt the weight of the situation. Not just the physical weight of his unconscious fiancée, but mainly the weight of the inexplicable circumstances that had brought them there. Why had Margaret fainted upon seeing Michael? Why did the boy seem so terrified of her presence? Unanswered questions pounded in his head as he hurried toward the garage. "Senora Rosa," he called, turning one last time, "take good care of Michael. Don't let him get scared. I'll be back as soon as possible." Margaret's face, usually so full of life and determination, was now pale as wax, with an expression Richard had never seen before, a mixture of fear and something else, something he couldn't identify. As he carefully placed her in the back seat of the car, he noticed that her hands were icy cold and her body was trembling slightly, despite the afternoon heat. "What's happening, Margaret?" he whispered, more to himself than to her as he closed the car door. Before getting into the car, Richard cast one last glance toward the mansion. Through the kitchen window, he could see Michael sitting at the table, his little legs swinging without touching the ground, while Senora Rosa tried to make him drink something hot. The scene seemed strangely out of place, like a painting where something was subtly wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. His instinct told him there was much more to that story than he could see, but now his priority was to ensure Margaret was all right. The drive to the hospital was a torture of conflicting thoughts. Richard alternated his gaze between the road ahead and Margaret's reflection in the rearview mirror, still unconscious in the back seat. It was the second time in less than 24 hours that he had made that same journey, first with Michael and now with his fiancée. The coincidence seemed too great to be just that, a coincidence. There was something connecting all those events, he could feel it, but the puzzle pieces refused to fit together in his mind. Margaret's phone started ringing in her purse, the shrill sound breaking the tense silence inside the car. Richard thought about answering, but something stopped him. The name flashing on the screen, Elaine Accounting, meant nothing to him, but for some reason he felt that call was part of the mystery that was beginning to form. He let the phone ring until it stopped, focusing again on the road and his unconscious fiancée. "What does accounting want so badly, Margaret?" he thought, as the hospital began to appear in the distance. The emergency room was bustling when Richard arrived carrying Margaret in his arms. It was the same hospital where he had been with Michael, and some nurses immediately recognized him. "Mr. Coleman again?" one of them asked, running to help with a gurney. Richard merely nodded, his mind a jumble of worries, as he carefully placed Margaret on the mobile bed. Her face remained as pale as paper, but now her eyelids were fluttering slightly, as if she were having a nightmare. "What happened to her?" asked the doctor, who quickly approached, beginning to examine Margaret's vital signs. Richard hesitated for a moment, realizing how strange the situation sounded. She fainted as soon as she walked into the house. I was coming in with a child who—" He stopped, noticing how every word he said seemed to make the story even more suspicious. The doctor looked up from her examination, her professional expression masking any judgment. "How long has she been unconscious?" she questioned, turning her attention back to Margaret's pupils. "About 20 minutes, Richard replied, running his hands through his greying hair in a nervous gesture. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket. Probably Mrs. Rosa with news about Michael, but he couldn't answer it now. The doctor continued her examination, murmuring instructions to the nurses who were beginning to connect Margaret to various monitors. The rhythmic beeping of the machines filled the environment, creating an anguishing soundtrack for Richard's chaotic thoughts. "She had been drinking when she fainted," he added, remembering the broken glass. The minutes dragged on as the medical team worked. Richard watched helplessly, his mind replaying the events of the last 24 hours in search of some meaning. Michael's accident, the shelter story, Margaret's inexplicable fainting. There was a connection there, he could feel it, but it was like trying to put together a puzzle in the dark. Margaret's cell phone, which he had pocketed, rang again. The same name blinked on the screen, Elaine Accounting. This time something about the name triggered an alert in his mind. "Mr. Coleman," the doctor called, interrupting his thoughts. "Her vital signs are stable, but we need to run some tests to understand what caused the fainting. Is there any family history of heart problems? Or has she been under a lot of stress lately?" Richard frowned, realizing he knew surprisingly little about his fiancée's medical history. "She has been working a lot," he responded vaguely, "with the wedding and other projects." The word projects left a bitter taste in his mouth, as if he were touching the tip of something much bigger and darker. It was at that moment that Margaret began to mumble, her words coming out jumbled and confused. Richard and the doctor quickly approached the gurney. "The wedding, the child, can't," she slurred, her face contorted in an expression of anguish. The doctor made some notes on her clipboard, but Richard had frozen in place. Those disconnected words, though almost inaudible, carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Why was his fiancée muttering the name of the boy he had just brought home? The phone in his pocket vibrated again, but this time it was his own device. The message blinking on the screen was from Mrs. Rosa. "Mr. Richard, the boy is very agitated. He said he needs to tell something important." Richard felt his heart rate accelerate. He looked at his fiancée on the gurney, still muttering disconnected words, and then at the message on his phone. In that moment, he was certain he was about to uncover something that would change everything. The shrill sound of one of the monitors cut through the air, making everyone in the room jump. In the midst of the ensuing confusion, with doctors and nurses rushing to check the equipment, no one noticed when Margaret slightly opened her eyes and a single tear rolled down her face. The hospital room was enveloped in a disturbing silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors. Richard remained seated by the bed where Margaret lay, watching her pale face for any sign of consciousness. The last few hours had been a confused sequence of tests and consultations, leaving him exhausted and even more worried. His phone continued to vibrate periodically with messages from Mrs. Rosa about Michael, but he could barely concentrate on the words he read, his thoughts always returning to his unconscious fiancée. The doctor entered the room, flipping through a clipboard with the test results. Her professional expression revealed nothing as she checked Margaret's vital signs on the monitors. "Mr. Coleman," she began, adjusting her glasses, "all the tests came back normal. There's nothing physically wrong with your fiancée." Richard frowned, confused. How could there be nothing wrong when Margaret had literally fainted in his arms? "But then, doctor, what caused the fainting?" he questioned, his voice betraying the anxiety he felt. The doctor pulled up a chair, sitting across from Richard with a softer expression. "The symptoms suggest a classic case of acute stress," she explained, consulting her notes. "The pressure of the wedding, combined with other responsibilities, may have overwhelmed her nervous system. It's more common than you might think, especially in young people with many duties." Richard nodded mechanically, but something about that explanation didn't seem to fit completely. The fainting had happened exactly when Margaret saw Michael. Could it just be a coincidence? A subtle movement on the hospital bed caught everyone's attention. Margaret was beginning to show signs of waking up, her eyelids fluttering slightly. The doctor immediately approached, checking her pupillary responses with a small flashlight. Richard stood up from his chair, his heart pounding, anxiously watching every small movement from his fiancée. After being unconscious for so long, she was finally coming to, and he had so many questions he hardly knew where to begin. Margaret slowly opened her eyes, blinking several times as if trying to adjust her vision to the light in the room. For a brief moment, her gaze seemed disoriented, almost frightened, but she quickly regained her usual composure. "What? What happened?" she asked, her voice hoarse and weak. The doctor began asking routine questions, checking her temporal and spatial orientation, while Richard held her hand, noticing how cold and slightly trembling it was. "You gave us quite a scare, sweetheart," he said softly, studying her reactions. The color was starting to return to Margaret's face, but there was something different in her expression. A shadow, a subtle tension that Richard had never noticed before. The doctor continued her examination, asking questions about how she felt and if she remembered the moments before the faint. Margaret answered everything with her usual elegance, but Richard could perceive a slight tremor in her voice, especially when the doctor mentioned the exact moment of the faint. "The last thing I remember was seeing Richard coming home," she said, avoiding mentioning Michael's presence. The nurses entered the room carrying a tray with water and medication, creating a small distraction that Richard took advantage of to observe his fiancée more closely. There was something about the way she avoided his direct gaze, the way her hands moved nervously over the hospital sheet, that aroused his suspicions. The doctor had said it was just stress, but his instinct told him there was much more to that story than it appeared. "Margaret," he called softly, "we need to talk about what happened." The way she tensed her shoulders when she heard those words did not go unnoticed. As soon as the doctor and nurses left the room, a heavy silence settled between Richard and Margaret. She adjusted herself in the hospital bed, her hands nervously smoothing the white sheet, while he watched her with a mixture of concern and mistrust. "The doctor said it was stress," Richard began, his voice gentle but firm. Margaret forced a weak smile, still avoiding looking directly at him. "It must be all this wedding planning," she replied, her voice taking on a tone that tried to sound carefree. "You know how I am a perfectionist with details." Richard leaned forward in his chair, studying his fiancée's reactions closely. There was something about the way she spoke, an underlying tension he had never noticed before. "Margaret, when I arrived home, did you see something that scared you?" he asked, carefully choosing his words. Her fingers momentarily stopped fidgeting with the sheet, and Richard noticed a slight tremor in her lips before she answered, "Scared? No, of course not. I was just very tired and worried about your disappearance. Why were you gone for so long, Richard?" Her question was an obvious attempt to change the course of the conversation, but Richard decided to seize the opportunity to address the matter that really mattered. "Something happened last night," he began, noticing how Margaret held her breath for a moment. "I was distracted with messages about the wedding, and I hit a child." Margaret's face paled again, but she maintained her composure. "My God, Richard, is the child okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, he's okay now," Richard replied, not taking his eyes off his fiancée's face. "In fact, that's what we need to talk about. His name is Michael, and he told me a very sad story about the shelter he ran away from." Margaret's hands gripped the sheet tightly, her knuckles turning white with the pressure. "A shelter," she repeated, her voice sounding strangely controlled. "What a sad story. But why did you bring him to our home?" The question came out with a tone that mixed curiosity and something else, something that sounded dangerously close to fear. Richard sighed deeply before continuing. "I couldn't let him go back to that place. From what he told me, the conditions are terrible. Children starving, being mistreated." He paused, observing how Margaret bit her lower lip, a habit she only displayed when she was extremely nervous. "I thought maybe we could help him through the institute," he continued. "You're always talking about the wonderful work they do there, helping people in need." The heart monitor next to the bed registered a sudden acceleration in Margaret's heartbeat, but she quickly recomposed herself. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The institute would be perfect for him. We have an excellent structure, with dedicated professionals." Her words sounded rehearsed, as if she were reciting a well-memorized script. I can arrange everything as soon as I get out of here." Richard noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, contradicting the confidence of her words. The last rays of the sun were coming through the hospital window, creating unsettling shadows in the room. Richard watched as they danced on Margaret's face, highlighting the tension in her features that she was so desperately trying to hide. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, putting his hand on hers. Margaret flinched slightly at the touch but kept the artificial smile. "I'm fine, dear. I just need to rest a bit. It's been a lot of emotions for one day." The sound of Margaret's cell phone broke the tense silence that had settled in the room. It was the same person again, Elaine from accounting. But before Richard could mention the insistent calls, Margaret quickly turned off the device. "Work," she said with a forced smile, putting the phone under her pillow. "They never stop calling, even knowing I'm in the hospital." Isis, there was something about the way she pronounced the word work that made Richard frown, a discordant note in her usually melodious voice. "Speaking of work," she continued, assuming a more professional tone, "I think I can resolve Michael's situation quickly." Her fingers drummed nervously on the edge of the bed as she spoke, a habit Richard had never noticed before. "The Institute has connections with several upstanding families who are always looking for children to adopt. We can find the perfect home for him in a matter of days." The speed with which she presented the solution, the barely disguised anxiety in her voice, everything seemed strangely out of place. Richard observed how Margaret seemed increasingly agitated as she elaborated her plans for Michael, her eyes avoiding meeting his, her hands gesturing more than usual. "In fact," she said, sitting up straighter on the bed, "I can call the Institute's social worker right now. The sooner we resolve this, the better for the boy, isn't it?" Her haste to transfer Michael away from her home was almost palpable, as if each minute the boy spent under her roof was an invisible threat. A nurse entered the room to check Margaret's vital signs, and Richard noticed how she seemed almost relieved by the interruption. As the professional did their work, he reflected on his fiancée's behavior. Margaret had always been passionate about her work at the Institute, always talking about how they helped people in need. But something about her current enthusiasm sounded false, almost desperate. "You're right," he said when they were alone again. "The Institute would be perfect for Michael. After all, you always say they offer the best conditions for children." Richard's words seemed to have a strange effect on Margaret. For a brief moment, something flashed across her eyes. Guilt, fear, but she quickly regained her mask of professional efficiency. "Exactly," she replied, her voice taking on an almost mechanical tone. "We guarantee all the necessary support, proper nutrition, quality education, recreational activities." She continued listing the benefits, as if she was giving a sales pitch, her voice growing shriller with each word. The sun had completely set, and the artificial hospital lights cast unsettling shadows on Margaret's face as she continued to elaborate her plans. "I can sort everything out as soon as I'm discharged," she insisted, her voice blending anxiety and determination. "We don't need to bother Mrs. Rosa with a child at home, especially so close to the wedding." Richard nodded slowly, but his mind registered every little detail of his fiancée's behavior. The way she avoided mentioning Michael's name, how her hands never stayed still, how her smile seemed increasingly forced. Richard's phone vibrated in his pocket, another message from Mrs. Rosa about Michael. Before he could check it, Margaret started speaking again, her voice taking on an almost pleading tone. "Richard, dear, you trust me, don't you? I know exactly how to help the boy. The Institute specializes in this. Tomorrow I can start the procedures to find a perfect family for him." Her words sounded sweet, but there was an underlying urgency that didn't match the situation. It was as if she was trying to convince not only Richard but herself as well. As the night wore on, a sense of unease grew in Richard's chest. Margaret's behavior, her carefully chosen words, her haste to get rid of Michael, it all pointed to something bigger, something he couldn't yet fully comprehend. When she finally closed her eyes, exhausted from the conversation, Richard picked up his phone to read Mrs. Rosa's message. The text that appeared on the screen made his blood run cold. "Mr. Richard, Michael is very agitated. He said he has something very important to tell about the matter." The sun was already setting when Richard's car passed through the mansion's gates. Margaret had insisted on going home immediately after being discharged from the hospital, claiming she would feel better in her own environment. Beside her in the back seat, she kept her back straight and her chin raised, as if wanting to prove she had fully recovered from the fainting spell. However, her fingers kept fidgeting with the strap of her purse, betraying the nervousness she tried to hide. The mansion was silent when they entered, their steps echoing on the marble floor of the entrance hall. Mrs. Rosa appeared quickly, her round face etched with worry. "Mrs. Margaret, thank goodness you're home already. The boy has been very quiet, barely ate anything." Margaret forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, while her gaze scanned the room looking for Michael. The boy was sitting on one of the luxurious sofas, looking even smaller and more frail amidst the imposing furniture. When his eyes met Margaret's, he immediately shrank back like a frightened bird. Richard didn't fail to notice the boy's reaction, but attributed the behavior to the recent trauma of the accident. "Michael," he called gently, "how are you feeling?" The boy just nodded his head, his large eyes never leaving Margaret's figure, who now moved through the room with studied grace. There was something about the way the boy watched her, a mixture of fear and recognition that made Richard frown slightly. Margaret, for her part, seemed to make a conscious effort not to look directly at Michael. The uncomfortable silence was broken by the ring of Richard's cell phone. It was one of his managers, reminding him of the important meeting with investors that had been scheduled for that evening. Margaret immediately spoke up. "Dear, you can't miss this meeting. It's that project you've been planning for months." Her voice sounded sweet and concerned, but there was an underlying urgency to her words. Richard hesitated, looking between his fiancée and the boy. "I don't know if I should leave you two alone so soon after your fainting spell," he pondered. Margaret approached Richard, placing a delicate hand on his arm. "Don't worry about me, love. I'm much better already, and I can take the opportunity to prepare a comfortable room for Michael." As she spoke, her eyes briefly flickered to the boy, and for an instant, something cold and hard passed through her gaze. It was so quick that Richard almost believed he had imagined it. Michael, however, shrank further into the sofa, his small hands gripping the fabric of his new clothes tightly. The tension in the atmosphere was almost palpable, but Richard couldn't understand its origin. Part of him wanted to stay, investigate that strange dynamic that was established between his fiancée and the boy. However, the meeting was really important, and Margaret seemed so willing to help. "Okay," he finally conceded, "but call me if you need anything." As he picked up his briefcase and car keys, he didn't notice the subtle smile that formed on Margaret's lips, nor the shudder that ran through Michael's small body. The sound of Richard's footsteps faded down the hallway, and soon the noise of the departing car indicated his departure. Mrs. Rosa had withdrawn to the kitchen, leaving Margaret and Michael alone in the huge living room. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with hidden meanings. Margaret remained still for a moment, her elegant posture contrasting with the evident tension in her shoulders. When she finally turned to face Michael, her face had changed completely. The sweet smile had disappeared, replaced by an expression that made the boy's blood run cold. Margaret waited until the last echo of Mrs. Rosa's footsteps faded in the direction of the kitchen before making her move. With calculated steps, she approached Michael, who remained huddled on the couch. Her demeanor had changed completely. The artificial sweetness had given way to a calculating coldness, and her eyes, once gentle, now shone with a frightening hardness. "So the little mouse thought he could escape the trap," she whispered, her eyes glinting with icy cruelty. "How convenient for you to have been run over by my fiancé. But you know what happens to rats that flee the cage? They end up dead in the street, or worse." Her smile as she uttered the last word made Michael tremble from head to toe. Michael tried to get up, but Margaret stopped him, placing a hand on his shoulder with enough force to keep him seated. The boy trembled under her touch, but found the courage to speak. "Why does the lady do this? Why do you treat the children that way?" His voice was small, but carried an accusation that made Margaret's eyes flash with anger. She leaned closer, her expensive perfume now seeming suffocating. "Don't pretend to be innocent, you insignificant worm. You know very well how the world works, don't you? Some people like me were born to have everything, to step on filth like you. And others, like you and your deplorable little friends, were born to crawl and beg for crumbs. That's how the world works, and that's how it will continue to be." Her tone of voice was so laden with contempt that it made Michael's stomach churn. The distant sound of dishes in the kitchen made Margaret straighten up quickly, her mask of kindness returning briefly. When the noise ceased, she grabbed Michael's arm, pulling him away from the couch. "Let's take a walk to your new room," she announced loudly in case anyone was listening. As she dragged him through the luxurious corridors of the mansion, she continued to speak in a threatening whisper. "Do you have any idea how many worms like you I had to crush to build all this? Years planning every detail, manipulating those idiots, stealing every penny from those filthy children, watching you starve while I built my empire, and now an insignificant little mouse like you thinks you can destroy everything I've conquered." Her voice dripped pure venom, and her eyes shone with perverse pleasure at seeing the fear on Michael's face. Upon reaching one of the guest rooms, Margaret practically threw Michael inside, closing the door behind her. The room was spacious and elegant, but at that moment it seemed like a prison to the terrified boy. "You do recognize the shelter, don't you?" she asked, her voice taking on a dangerously soft tone. Michael nodded tremulously, gathering courage to respond. "Yes, Ma'am, you used to visit sometimes when there were important people there. But after they left, everything became bad again. No proper food, no blankets in the cold." Margaret's laugh was cold and humorless. "Impressive how observant you are, Michael. Too bad all that cleverness of yours is going to cause you trouble." She began to circle the room like a predator, her high heels marking each step on the wooden floor. "Do you know what happens to children who know too much, who ask too many questions?" Michael backed up until he was against the wall, his eyes wide with fear. I just wanted help," he mumbled, his voice trembling. Margaret stopped her predatory pacing, turning abruptly to face Michael. Her face was contorted in an expression of controlled fury that made her almost unrecognizable. "Listen closely, you meddlesome little rat," she hissed, approaching him again. "If you say one word to Richard about the shelter, about me, about anything, well, let's just say your little friends who stayed there will pay the price. Understood?" The threat hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, making Michael tremble even more. The boy hugged his own body, as if trying to protect himself from Margaret's cruel words. But Mr. Richard said he would help me," he tried, his voice barely above a whisper. The smile that formed on Margaret's face was a terrible thing to behold. "Richard is a good man, isn't he? So naive, so easy to manipulate. Why do you think I'm marrying him? And now you little problem, won't ruin everything I've planned." Her words were like poison, destroying any hope Michael might still have had. Margaret walked to the bedroom closet, opening the doors with a sharp motion. "We're going to do this the easy way," she said, grabbing a dark coat from inside. "You're going to put this on, and we're going to take a quiet walk to my car." Her movements were precise and calculated, as if she was executing a plan she had mentally rehearsed many times before. Michael remained leaning against the wall, his eyes following her every move like a cornered animal watching a predator. The sound of Margaret's cell phone cut through the tense air of the room. It was Elaine again, but this time she answered quickly. "Everything is under control. I'm bringing the problem back for you to deal with." Her voice was cold and professional, completely different from the sweet tone she used with Richard. Hanging up the phone, she turned her attention back to Michael. "Your little friends at the shelter are very worried about you," she said, her cruel smile contradicting her words. "Let's pay them a visit, shall we?" "Miss Rose!" Michael tried to yell, but Margaret was faster. In a fluid motion, she covered the boy's mouth with one hand, while the other gripped his arm with enough force to leave marks. "Don't even think about it, you pest," she whispered in his ear. "Open that filthy mouth again, and tomorrow your little friends will accidentally sleep locked in the basement. That cold, dark basement you know so well. And this time, I might even forget to feed them for a whole week. Besides, who do you think Richard will believe? Me, his adoring and sophisticated fiancé, or a dirty lying sewer rat like you? No one ever believes scum like you, Michael. No one will ever believe you." Her words were pure poison, and each syllable made the boy shrink further. Silent tears streamed down Michael's face as he stopped struggling, defeated by Margaret's calculated cruelty. Margaret worked quickly, dressing Michael in the coat and arranging his hair to look natural. "Let's take a walk to the kitchen first," she instructed, her tone falsely cheerful returning. "You're going to smile and tell Miss Rose that you're very happy, because I'm going to show you the institute, understood?" Michael nodded mechanically, his small body trembling under her firm touch on his shoulder. Margaret's smile was icy as she added, "And remember, if you try anything, your little friends will pay the price for your loose tongue." In the kitchen, Miss Rose was busy preparing dinner. Margaret entered with Michael, her mask of kindness perfectly in place. "Miss Rose, I'm going to take Michael to see the Institute now," she announced cheerfully. "Isn't that wonderful, Michael?" The boy forced a trembling smile, his words coming out almost inaudible. "Yes, ma'am." The governess seemed to hesitate for a moment, her kind eyes studying the scene before her. "But shouldn't you be resting? And dinner is almost ready." Margaret dismissed her concerns with an elegant wave of her hand. "Nonsense, I'm already feeling great. And the sooner we resolve Michael's situation, the better for everyone. Don't you agree?" Her voice was laden with hidden meanings that only the boy could understand. Miss Rose still looked uncertain, but years of service had taught her not to question her employer's decisions. "Don't be out too long then," she pleaded, turning her attention back to the dinner preparations. The walk to the garage was made in tense silence. Margaret kept her hand firmly on Michael's shoulder, her fingers tightening whenever he threatened to slow down. Her sports car was parked in the shadows, away from the prying eyes of the staff. "Get in," she ordered, opening the passenger door. Michael obeyed, his legs trembling so badly he could barely move. Margaret walked around the car, her features twisting into an expression of cruel triumph as she started the engine. As the car glided silently out of the property, Margaret looked at the huddled boy in the seat beside her. "You know, Michael," she said, her voice taking on an almost contemplative tone, "you could have had a much easier life if you weren't so curious. Now you'll learn the hard way that some people weren't born to have a voice." The car accelerated down the dark road, taking Michael back to the nightmare he had tried to escape. A few hours later, Margaret's car pulled up in front of a grey, dilapidated building on the outskirts of town. The shelter, which bore a faded sign on its facade with hopeful words about charity and love, was in reality a monument to abandonment and cruelty. Margaret gripped Michael's arm tightly, dragging him out of the vehicle. The boy stumbled, his legs numb from the tense journey. But she didn't slow her pace, pulling him mercilessly up the broken steps of the entrance. The night clerk, a thin woman with a severe expression named Alice, widened her eyes as she saw Margaret arrive with Michael. "Mrs. Margaret, we weren't expecting you at this hour." Her voice trembled slightly as she opened the rusted iron gate. The metallic sound echoed through the empty hallways like a warning scream. Margaret shoved Michael inside with such force that he fell to his knees on the dirty floor. "Where are the others?" she asked, her eyes scanning the dark surroundings with disdain. "Locked in the dormitories, ma'am," Alice replied, watching Michael try to get up. Margaret smiled, a smile that had nothing human about it. "Great. Our little runaway here needs to learn a lesson about obedience." Her high heels echoed down the hallway as she approached a heavy door at the end of the corridor. "Open the punishment wing," she ordered Alice. "Our little friend is going to spend the night cleaning that filthy place, and no food or water until tomorrow night." Michael felt his heart race with fear. The punishment wing was the place all the children at the shelter feared most, a damp, dark basement where time seemed to stand still. Alice hesitated for a moment, her eyes moving nervously between Margaret and the boy. "But Ma'am, he looks hurt from the accident." Margaret spun around sharply, her eyes sparking with cold rage. "Are you questioning my orders, Alice? Do you want to keep him company down there?" The employee paled, quickly grabbing the key ring from her belt. "No, ma'am, sorry, ma'am," she muttered, her hands shaking as she searched for the right key. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. A smell of mold and despair rose from that place, making Michael instinctively recoil. Margaret pushed him towards the stairs, her voice dripping with venom. "Go down, you insolent worm, and thank me for being merciful. Tomorrow we'll talk about your future here, if you still have one." Michael stumbled down the first few steps, the darkness swallowing his small figure as he descended. Alice handed him a bucket with cleaning supplies, avoiding looking into his eyes. Margaret watched with satisfaction as the door was locked again. "No one goes down until tomorrow night," she ordered. "If I find out anyone disobeyed my orders, they'll bitterly regret it." Her eyes fixed on Alice with a clear threat. The employee merely nodded, putting the keys away with shaking hands. The sound of Margaret's heels echoed down the hallway again as she headed towards the administration room. "Elaine should be arriving for our meeting," she announced. "I don't want to be interrupted by anything or anyone." In the darkness of the basement, Michael huddled against the cold wall, trying to hold back the tears streaming down his face. The bucket of cleaning supplies had tipped over beside him, spilling a strong smell of disinfectant that couldn't mask the odor of decay and neglect in the place. Through the floorboards above, he could hear Margaret's footsteps receding, and each echo sounded like a death sentence. "Please, God," he whispered into the darkness, "help me get out of here." The sound of voices began to filter through the floorboards above, catching Michael's attention. He immediately recognized Margaret's voice, now devoid of any trace of the artificial sweetness she used in front of Richard. A second voice, which he identified as Elaine, the accountant, sounded nervous and agitated. Michael silently dragged himself across the damp floor until he found a small gap between the boards, positioning himself to better hear the conversation taking place in the office above. "The numbers don't lie, Margaret." Elaine's voice trembled slightly. "We've already diverted over 5 million from the Institute in the last 2 years. If someone investigates more closely..." Margaret's laugh cut through the air like a razor. "And who's going to investigate? Richard? That idiot is so in love he'd sign his own death sentence if I asked. Besides, tomorrow at 3 in the afternoon we'll be married, and half of everything he owns will be legally mine." The contempt in her voice made Michael feel sick, but he remained motionless, absorbing every word. Elaine sounded increasingly agitated. "But what about his other companies, the hotels, the construction firms? Everything you've been diverting from them through the Institute?" The sound of a glass being violently set down on the table interrupted her words. "Shut up," Margaret hissed. "No one's going to find out anything. You know why? Because the Institute is perfect for it. Who's going to suspect a charity? It's the perfect cover to launder as much money as we want. And after the wedding, with direct access to his main accounts, we won't even have to worry about these little diversions." The ensuing silence was broken by the sound of papers being shuffled. "And what about the boy?" Elaine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's seen and heard too much." Margaret's response made Michael's blood run cold. "After the wedding, we'll take care of him. An accident, maybe. Kids go missing all the time, don't they? And since we're going to close this place down after I have access to Richard's money, we can make it look like he ran away during the chaos of shutting down the shelter." Michael had to cover his own mouth to keep from screaming when he heard Margaret continue. "In fact, we can solve all our problems at once. An accidental fire during the night. Terrible tragedy, all those poor children. The insurance would pay a fortune, which would naturally be managed by me, as Richard's devoted wife and administrator of the Institute." The coldness with which she discussed murdering dozens of children made Michael tremble from head to toe. Elaine sounded equally horrified. "Margaret, this is murder." The sound of high heels cut through the air, followed by a dull thump. "It's survival." Margaret's voice was pure venom. "Do you think I got this far by being nice? Those children are just resources, numbers on a spreadsheet. And you, dear Elaine, are just as guilty as I am. Every diverted penny, every falsified document, your fingerprints are all over it. So I suggest you keep doing exactly as I say, or you might end up keeping the children company in that accident." The sound of nervous footsteps indicated that Elaine was pacing back and forth. "The documents. All the records of the embezzlement are in the safe in the archive room. If someone finds..." Margaret interrupted her with a cold laugh. "No one will find anything. After the wedding, when I have full access to Richard's resources, we'll burn everything. The shelter, the documents, the evidence, and anyone who knows too much." The last words were spoken with a clear threat that made Elaine audibly swallow hard. Through the crack, Michael could see Margaret's shoes walking around the office, the sound of her heels punctuating each word like nails in a coffin. "And now go home and rest. Tomorrow will be a very special day. At 3 in the afternoon I'll be Mrs. Coleman, and that old fool's entire empire will be in my hands." The malice in her voice was so palpable it seemed to poison the very air. Michael remained absolutely still until he heard the office door close and the footsteps recede down the hallway. The silence that followed Margaret and Elaine's departure was as heavy as lead. Michael waited a few more minutes, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode. He needed to act fast. The wedding would be at 3 o'clock the next afternoon, and he was the only person who could stop Margaret from destroying more lives. Looking around the dark basement, his eyes adjusted enough to identify an old pipe running up one of the walls. It was his only chance of escape. With trembling hands, Michael began stacking some old crates he found in the basement. Every movement had to be calculated. The slightest noise could alert Alice, who was likely still in the hallway above. The pipe was rusty and unstable, but for a small, lightweight boy like him, it might be strong enough. "You can do this," he whispered to himself, starting to climb. "Think of the other kids, you have to save them." Upon reaching the ceiling, Michael discovered that one of the boards was loose. With extreme caution, he moved it enough to create an opening. The sound of metal scraping against wood sounded deafening to his ears, but no one seemed to notice. Emerging into the dark first-floor hallway, he quickly got his bearings. The archive room was at the end of the hall, right next to the office where Margaret usually received important visitors. His bare feet made no sound on the cold floor as he moved like a shadow down the corridors. The archive room door was locked, but Michael knew where Alice kept the spare key, under the wilted plant pot near the entrance. Years of silently watching the staff had taught him all the secrets of the place. With trembling fingers, he retrieved the key and unlocked the door. The archive room smelled of old paper and secrets. Michael knew he didn't have much time. At any moment, Alice could make her rounds. The safe Elaine had mentioned was partially hidden behind a shelf. It was an old model with a numerical keypad. Michael had seen Margaret entering the code several times when she thought no one was watching. His hands were sweating as he typed in the numbers, the Institute's inauguration date. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing stacks of documents and a few recording tapes. Michael began frantically rummaging through the contents, his eyes scanning the pages. Financial reports, fake receipts, documents with astronomical sums being embezzled from the Institute and Richard's companies. There were also tapes that, from what was written on the labels, contained recordings of meetings where the schemes were discussed. A noise in the hallway made his heart stop. Footsteps were approaching, the unmistakable sound of Alice's shoes making her nightly rounds. In panic, Michael grabbed as many documents and tapes as he could carry, stuffing everything inside his shirt. He closed the safe and ran behind a filing cabinet just as a flashlight beam crossed the gap under the door. The seconds that followed seemed like an eternity. The doorknob turned slowly, and Michael held his breath. By some miracle, the key he had used jammed in the outside lock, preventing Alice from using hers. "How strange," she muttered, and after a few frustrated attempts, her footsteps receded down the hallway. Michael waited until the sound disappeared completely before moving. He exited the archive room like a cat, locking the door and returning the key to its hiding spot. The path to the back exit was the most dangerous. He would have to pass through the kitchen, where staff often gathered at night. But there was no choice. With the documents pressed against his chest, each step was an agony of fear and hope. Sweat trickled down his face as he slunk through the dark corridors. The back door was locked with a padlock, but Michael knew another way, a broken window in the laundry room that the staff covered with a loose board. He carefully removed the board, feeling the cold night air touch his face. Freedom. He was so close. With one last look back, he slipped through the window and landed on the grass outside. There was no time to lose. The wedding would be in a few hours, and he needed to reach the church before Margaret destroyed more lives. Clutching the documents to his chest as if they were his most prized possession, Michael began to run into the night. His legs ached, his entire body protested, but he couldn't stop. Margaret's cruel words echoed in his mind, giving him strength to carry on. "Hang in there," he whispered, thinking of all the children he had left behind. "I'm going to save you. I promise." The church was magnificently decorated for the most anticipated wedding of the year. White flowers covered every available surface, their delicate petals contrasting with the somber thoughts running through Margaret's mind as she gazed at her reflection in the bridal suite mirror. Her reflection showed the image of the perfect bride. The French lace dress hugged her curves like a second skin. The delicate veil framed her face like an ethereal mist. But her eyes, usually so skilled at masking her true intentions, today revealed a disturbing mixture of triumph and anxiety. "10 minutes, Mrs. Margaret," announced one of the organizers, poking her head through the door. Margaret dismissed the woman with an impatient wave, returning to examining her reflection. In a few minutes, her entire plan would reach its apex. No longer would it be small embezzlements from insignificant companies. Soon half an empire would be in her hands. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the bouquet, not from nervousness about the wedding, but from anticipation of the power she was about to conquer. "Calm down," she whispered to herself. "You've come this far. Nothing can go wrong now." The murmur of the guests came muffled through the thick walls of the church. Margaret could imagine all those rich and powerful people seated in the pews, admiring the decor for which she had made Richard pay a fortune. Poor fools, all of them. Especially Richard, with his kind heart and blind trust. It was almost pathetic how easily he had fallen into her trap, how he had believed every sweet word, every loving gaze she had so carefully calculated. The sound of the wedding march began to play, and Margaret felt her heart quicken. This was the moment she had planned for so long. Each step down the aisle would be a step towards the absolute power she so craved. She thought of Michael, locked in the basement of the shelter, and a cruel smile played on her lips for an instant before she replaced it with the serene expression she had rehearsed so many times. Soon it will all be over, she thought, and no one will ever know the truth. The church doors opened, revealing the central aisle covered by a red carpet. Richard awaited her at the altar, his radiant smile of genuine happiness making Margaret feel a twinge of something that could be guilt if she were still capable of feeling such an emotion. But that feeling was quickly smothered by the wave of triumph that washed over her as she began her walk. Each step brought her closer to her goal. Each movement brought her nearer to the victory she had so meticulously planned. The guests sighed as she passed, admiring her beauty, her grace, her seemingly shy and loving smile. If they could see inside her mind at that moment, they would have recoiled in horror. Margaret thought of the millions she had already embezzled, of the starving children at the shelter, of the empire she was about to steal, and each thought only made her smile seem even more radiant. "You are an extraordinary actress," Elaine had once said, and Margaret could not help but agree. The priest began the ceremony, his solemn voice echoing through the church as he spoke of love, trust, and fidelity. Margaret barely heard the words, focused solely on maintaining her mask of an emotional bride. Her thoughts wandered to the safe in the records room, to the documents proving her crimes. Tomorrow all that would be ashes, along with the shelter and its unwanted little witnesses. Just a few more minutes, she thought, and nothing will be able to stop me. It was when the decisive moment came. The priest turned to her, asking if she accepted Richard as her lawful husband. Margaret let a tear of emotion roll down her cheek as she answered in a clear, steady voice, "I do." The words rang through the church like a sentence, carrying a weight that only she fully understood. The priest then turned to Richard, who was smiling like a child on Christmas morning, beginning to ask him the same question. The priest had barely begun to ask Richard the question when the heavy doors of the church burst open with a thunderous bang. The sound echoed off the sacred walls like a clap of thunder, causing every guest to turn in their seats. There, standing in the entrance, was Michael. His clothes were dirty and torn, his bare feet leaving marks on the red carpet, but his eyes shone with a fierce determination. "Stop the wedding." His childlike voice rang out clear and strong through the church. "She's a liar." Margaret felt her blood run cold. It was impossible. He should have been locked in the shelter's basement, unable to interfere with her plans. But there he was, clutching a fat envelope of documents and some cassette tapes to his chest. Richard took a step forward, confused. "Michael, what are you doing here?" The boy began walking down the central aisle, his eyes fixed on Margaret. "She's not who you think she is. She steals money from the institute, mistreats the children at the shelter, and plans to steal everything you own." A shocked murmur ran through the church as Michael approached the altar. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, forcing a concerned smile. "Dear," she said, touching Richard's arm, "the boy is clearly disturbed from the accident. We cannot." But Michael cut her off, his voice trembling with rage. "No. Enough. I want to see what the child has in his hands." He took one of the tapes from the envelope and held it up. "It's all recorded here, everything she said last night at the shelter. About how she embezzles money from your companies, how she mistreats the children, how she planned an accident to kill us after the wedding." Margaret's face lost all color. She recognized the tape. It was one of those kept in the safe of the records room, along with all the documents proving her crimes. How had that little demon managed to gain access to them? Richard looked between his small accuser and his fiancée, the confusion on his face slowly turning into something darker. Margaret? His voice was laden with doubt and fear. What is he talking about? He's lying, exclaimed Margaret, her voice rising an octave. He's trying to ruin our special moment. Richard, you're not going to believe the words of a street boy against me, are you? But Michael was already handing the documents to Richard. Look at the numbers, Mr. Richard. All the embezzlements, all the false reports. She stole millions from you and used the money that should feed the children of the orphanage to buy jewelry and expensive clothes. Richard began flipping through the documents, his face paling with each page. Margaret could see her life crumbling before her eyes as he recognized his own signature on authorizations she had manipulated, checked numbers that didn't make sense, uncovered the truth about the empire of lies she had built. This can't be true, he muttered, but his voice already carried the weight of certainty. Michael took another step forward, his small figure trembling with exhaustion and determination. Play the tape, he challenged. Let everyone hear what she really is. One of the deacons quickly brought a sound system that was in the sacristy. The silence in the church was absolute as the tape was placed in the device. Margaret felt her legs weaken when her own voice began to sound through the speakers, cruel and cold, discussing her plans for embezzlement, the murder of children, the manipulation of Richard. The guests began to rise from their seats, expressions of horror and indignation on their faces. Richard had taken several steps back, as if Margaret's proximity now burned him. The bouquet of flowers fell from her trembling hands, the white roses spilling across the floor like tears. Richard, her voice was now a desperate whisper, I can explain. But there was no possible explanation. Her own voice on the recording continued to reveal every sordid detail of her crimes, destroying every facade she had so carefully built. The recording continued echoing through the church, each word from Margaret sounding like a nail in her own coffin. Her cold voice discussing the planning of the fire at the orphanage, laughing as she spoke about the children who would die, boasting about how she manipulated Richard. It was all there, exposed for everyone to hear. The guests, who moments before smiled and celebrated, now stared at her with a mixture of horror and revulsion. The bridal veil, which had once seemed ethereal, now weighed on her head like a crown of thorns. "Turn it off!" she screamed, her hysterical voice breaking the shocked silence of the church. But no one moved to obey her request. Richard stood still holding the documents proving her crimes, his face a mask of pain and betrayal. "All this time," he murmured, his voice trembling with restrained rage. "All this time you were robbing me, mistreating innocent children, plotting." He couldn't finish the sentence, the disgust evident in his expression. Margaret tried to take a step towards him, but he recoiled as if she were a venomous snake. Michael remained steadfast beside the altar, his small fists clenched, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and triumph. "She was going to kill all the children of the orphanage," he said, his clear voice cutting through the tense air of the church. "She was going to make it look like an accident, after she got half of Mr. Richard's fortune." The boy's words were like a trigger. Several guests began to rise, some already taking out their cell phones, probably to call the police. Margaret could see her world crumbling before her eyes, all of her meticulous plans reduced to dust. "You don't understand," she tried one last time, her voice almost unrecognizable. "I did all this for us, Richard, to have a better life, to—" But her words were cut short by her own voice from the recording, coldly describing how she planned to get rid of him after securing his fortune. The contrast between her desperate pleas and the calculated cruelty of her recorded voice was shocking. Richard shook his head, tears of anger streaming down his face. "There is no us, Margaret. There never was." It was too much for her to bear. Her legs, which had already been trembling violently, finally gave way. Margaret felt her body tilt backwards, the veil floating around her like a ghostly cloud. In the fall, her hands instinctively grasped at the flower arrangement on the altar, knocking over candlesticks and candles. The clatter of metal against marble floor mingled with the screams of the guests. The last thing she saw before her vision darkened completely was Michael's face. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a sorrow too mature for his age. Margaret collapsed at the feet of the altar, in a confusion of white lace and scattered flowers. Her dream of power turned into a public nightmare. The church doors opened, and guests were already leaving. But she saw nothing more, plunged into the darkness of her own defeat. The dream wedding had become her worst nightmare, and there were no more masks to hide her true nature from the world. Margaret awoke slowly, her head throbbing as if it had been struck by a hammer. The first thing she noticed was that she was lying on the couch in the main room of the mansion, still dressed in her now crumpled and stained wedding gown. The second thing she noticed was the silence, a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. And then her eyes met Richard's, sitting in his favorite armchair, watching her with an expression she had never seen on his normally gentle face. The twilight streamed in through the high windows of the mansion, painting elongated shadows on the walls. Scattered across the coffee table were all the documents Michael had stolen from the shelter, along with the cassette tapes that had destroyed their plans. Richard clutched a half-empty glass of whiskey, his fingers gripping the crystal so tightly that his knuckles were white. Margaret tried to sit up, her body protesting with each movement. "Richard," she began, her voice weak and hoarse, "I can explain." He raised a hand, silencing her with a brusque gesture utterly unlike his usual calm nature. "My lawyers have spent the last 2 hours poring over every document," he said, his voice controlled but laden with an icy fury. "Every falsified report, every embezzled fund, every penny you stole not just from me, but from those innocent children." Richard rose slowly from his armchair, setting the glass on the table with a delicacy that contrasted sharply with the storm raging in his eyes. Margaret felt a chill of fear run down her spine. She had never seen this gentle man display any hint of violence, but now she could sense something dangerous emanating from him. The clock chimed 6 o'clock, its toll sounding like harbingers of destruction in the tense silence of the room. Margaret watched as Richard walked over to the fireplace, where dozens of photos of the two of them were arranged on the mantelpiece. He picked one up, the first they had ever taken together 2 years ago when she had started working at the Institute. "You know what hurts the most?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "It's not the money. It's not even the lies. It's knowing that while I was planning our life together, you were planning my destruction." The last rays of the setting sun made the engagement ring on Margaret's finger glitter like a silent accusation. She tried one more time. "Richard, you don't understand. I did all of this for us so we could have a better future." Her words were cut off by the sound of the picture frame smashing against the wall, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. The crash made Margaret flinch back into the couch, finally realizing she was facing a man utterly different from the one she knew. Richard's eyes, normally so gentle, now burned with a rage she had never imagined possible. "For us?" His voice was a contained roar. "You were planning to kill me after the wedding. You were planning to murder innocent children. You turned a charity institute into your personal money laundering machine." Each accusation was like a lash, making Margaret recoil further into the couch. "But you know what's worse," he continued, advancing slowly. "I would have given it all to you willingly. Every penny, every business, every dream, everything you stole I would have shared with you out of love." The first object to go flying was a crystal vase that had been sitting on the side table. Richard seized it and hurled it against the wall with such force that shards ricocheted across the entire room. 2 years, he roared, his voice unrecognizable. 2 years watching you pretend to care about those children. 2 years believing I had found someone who shared my dreams of doing good. Next to be destroyed was a set of silver candlesticks, engagement gifts that now became projectiles for his rage. Margaret tried to get up from the couch, but her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. Her wedding gown, once the symbol of her imminent triumph, now imprisoned her like a cage of lace and silk. "Richard, please," she pleaded, but her pleas only seemed to fuel his fury. "Please?" he echoed with a bitter laugh. "Is that what the children at the shelter said when they went hungry, when they were locked in that dark basement? When you embezzled the money that should have fed them to buy your jewels and designer clothes?" The destruction continued, methodical and relentless. Richard seemed determined to shatter every object that symbolized the life they had planned together. Paintings were torn from the walls, furniture was upended, photographs were shredded. "You turned my dream of helping people into a nightmare," he thundered, knocking over an entire bookshelf. You used my trust, my love, my kindness as weapons against me, against innocent children." Margaret cowered behind the overturned couch, tears streaming down her face, smearing her perfect wedding makeup. The crashing of breaking glass and splintering wood echoed through the mansion like a macabre symphony. The servants, who would normally come running at any disturbance, wisely kept their distance. Richard grabbed an expensive bottle of wine Margaret had chosen for their honeymoon and hurled it into the fireplace. The red liquid streamed down the wall like blood, staining the white marble. "Every meeting, every dinner, every moment you smiled at me. It was all a lie." His voice was hoarse from shouting, but the rage only seemed to intensify. A survivor's photo frame caught Richard's attention. It was a picture of them at the Institute, surrounded by smiling children. The hypocrisy of the image seemed to strike him like a physical punch. "You smiled in the photos while planning to kill them," he said, his voice now dangerously low. "You posed as a benefactor while condemning them to hunger and cold." The glass of the frame cracked in his hand, blood dripping between his fingers, but he seemed not to notice the pain. The red drops dripped onto Margaret's white dress as she now crawled on the floor, trying to get away from the destruction. "Do you know what I found on the tapes?" Richard continued, kicking aside the debris of a lamp that blocked his path. "Your plans for after the marriage. How you laughed while planning my death, discussing how you'd fake an accident to get rid of the children." He approached her with slow, deliberate steps, like a predator cornering its prey. "You're a monster, Margaret. A monster wearing an angel's mask." Margaret tried to back away further, but found only the cold wall behind her. Her eyes frantically scanned the room, looking for an escape route, but found only destruction on all sides. Richard suddenly stopped amidst the wreckage, as if struck by a new realization. His gaze swept over the devastated room, the broken furniture, the shattered glass, until it settled once more on Margaret, still huddled against the wall in her stained wedding gown. "Do you know what's most ironic?" he said, his voice taking on an icy tone. "You planned every detail, every move, every lie, and you were brought down by a child, one of the children you so despised." With firm steps, he crossed the room to a small writing desk that had miraculously survived the destruction. He opened the drawer and took out a thick envelope, tossing it at Margaret's feet. "Here is all the money you earned working at the Institute. Just your legitimate salary, not a penny more." Margaret looked at the envelope as if it were a snake about to strike. "That's all you're taking from here. The rest, the jewelry, the clothes, the cars, everything you bought with stolen money, stays." Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out shaky and desperate. "You can't do this to me. I have nowhere to go." Richard's laugh was as cold as ice. "Nowhere to go? Just like those children had nowhere to go when you locked them in the basement? Just like they had nothing to eat when you diverted the food money?" He moved closer, his shadow looming over her like a sentence. "You're leaving this house exactly as you entered my life, with nothing but your lies." The last rays of the sun plunged the room into elongated shadows as Richard grabbed Margaret's arm, hauling her up forcefully. "No!" she screamed, trying to break free. "Richard, please! I can change! I can fix everything!" But he was already dragging her towards the front door, stepping over the debris of their shattered life. "Change?" His voice dripped with contempt. "People like you don't change, Margaret. People like you just find new victims." Reaching the front door, Richard flung it open. The cold night air hit Margaret like a slap, making her shiver in her thin dress. "Your documents and your salary money are in the envelope," he said, his voice now deathly calm. "Take it and leave." Margaret clutched the envelope with trembling fingers, tears streaming down her face. "Richard," she tried one last time, "everything I did," he cut her off with a harsh gesture, "was show your true nature. Now get out of my house before I call the police." Margaret stumbled out, her heels sinking into the lawn. She turned back one last time, only to see Richard standing in the doorway, his silhouette etched against the light from the mansion. "The authorities have already been notified about the embezzlement," he said. "I suggest you make use of this small head start I'm giving you, because tomorrow, once I'm done presenting all the evidence, there won't be a place in this city where you can hide." With those words, he slammed the door shut. Alone in the growing darkness, Margaret clutched the envelope to her chest, her wedding gown now resembling a white shroud. The lights in the mansion went out one by one, leaving her in complete blackness. The sound of her sobs echoed through the garden as she began to walk towards the gates, her broken heels making her stumble with every step. The cold night wind lifted her veil like a taunting ghost, a mocking reminder of the glorious future she had planned, and which now, like everything around her, lay in ruins. 3 months had passed since that fateful day at the church. Justice had finally caught up with Margaret. After weeks of meticulous investigation, she was arrested in a small town, still wearing the same tattered and soiled wedding dress. The evidence was incontrovertible. The documents, the recordings, the testimonies of the children and staff at the shelter, everything confirmed her crimes. The former shelter, once a place of nightmares, was now unrecognizable. Richard had dedicated every minute of his time, and a considerable portion of his fortune, to transforming it into something entirely new. The grey, peeling walls gave way to vibrant, cheerful colors. The dark basement was completely renovated and turned into a game room, and each bedroom now had comfortable beds with warm new blankets. Michael watched the changes with a mix of admiration and disbelief. The boy, who was once so small and scared, now walked through the shelter's corridors with quiet confidence. Richard had insisted that he participate in all the decisions about the renovation, from choosing the wall colors to the nutritious menu that would be served daily to the children. "What do you think of this space for the library?" Richard asked, showing a large and well-lit room. Michael smiled, remembering how he used to dream of having books to read during the long nights at the old shelter. "It's perfect," he replied, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The transformation wasn't limited to just the physical space. Richard had hired a full team of professionals, teachers, psychologists, doctors, nutritionists, all dedicated to ensuring that each child received not only basic care, but also the opportunity to develop their talents and dreams. The other children, who had previously lived in deplorable conditions, now flourished under the new care. The sound of laughter and play echoed through the corridors, replacing the oppressive silence that had once dominated the place. For Richard, every child's smile was like a balm for the wounds left by Margaret's betrayal. He had discovered that his true vocation was not merely making a fortune, but using his resources to make a difference in the lives of those truly in need. Watching Michael help the younger children with their lessons, Richard felt his heart swell with a pride he had never experienced before. "You've transformed my life as much as I've transformed this place," he told the boy one afternoon, as they shared a snack in the new kitchen. The most significant changes, however, happened in the relationship between Richard and Michael. What began as gratitude for the boy exposing the truth about Margaret had transformed into something much deeper. Richard saw in Michael not just the brave boy who had saved his empire, but also the son he had always wanted. The daily visits to the shelter turned into dinners at the mansion, weekend outings, and long conversations about dreams and fears. "Do you think one day I'll be able to call you Dad?" Michael asked one night, his voice trembling with hope. The boy's words touched Richard deeply. He had already started the adoption process weeks before, but was waiting for the right moment to tell Michael. "Actually," he replied, pulling an envelope from his briefcase, "I have something to show you." Inside the envelope were the adoption papers, already in the final stages of approval. Michael took the documents with trembling hands, his wide eyes scanning the words that promised to formalize what his heart already knew. He would finally have a family. The news of the adoption quickly spread through the shelter, bringing a wave of joy and hope to all the children. To them, seeing Michael, who had been one of their own, finding a family was proof that miracles happened. Richard took the opportunity to announce more changes. The shelter would be transformed into a foundation, with programs to support adoption and family support. "Every child here deserves a chance to have what Michael is having," he declared, during a meeting with the new team, his voice choked with emotion. Michael's move to the mansion was a special moment. Richard had personally prepared the boys' room, transforming one of the largest rooms into a space that perfectly reflected the tastes and dreams of his new son. Shelves filled with books covered an entire wall. Richard had noticed how Michael devoured every story he found. A new desk awaited the studies the boy so valued, and for the first time in his life, Michael had a closet full of new clothes, all chosen with care. Mrs. Rosa, who had been a silent witness to the entire transformation, now smiled to see the mansion, once so formal and cold, come to life with Michael's presence. The corridors that once echoed with Margaret's high heels now resounded with childish laughter and animated conversations between father and son. "You look 10 years younger, sir," she commented to Richard one morning as she served them breakfast. Richard agreed, realizing how Michael's presence had filled a void in his life he didn't even know existed. The nights at the mansion, once lonely for Richard, were now filled with precious moments. He discovered he loved helping Michael with his homework, impressed by the boy's intelligence and dedication. Together, they developed little rituals: hot chocolate before bed, shared story reading, long conversations about the day. "You know, Dad," Michael said one night, the word Dad still sounding new and precious on his lips. "Before I was afraid to sleep, but now I'm not." Richard felt his heart tighten, knowing he would never again allow his son to feel fear or loneliness. The positive impact was visible in both of them. Michael, who was once a scared and distrustful boy, was now developing into a confident and affectionate child. His grades at school were exemplary, and his teachers didn't spare praise for his behavior and intelligence. Richard, on the other hand, had found a new purpose in life. Business was still important, but now it was just a part of his existence. His true fulfillment came from watching Michael grow and develop, and from helping other children through the foundation. The regular visits to the shelter became a sacred commitment for the two of them. Michael made a point of staying in touch with his old friends, no longer as an abandoned child, but as someone who could offer hope and support. Richard watched with pride as his son became a living example that love and kindness could overcome any adversity. "You've taught me more about love and courage than anyone else," Richard confessed to Michael during one of those moments. "And you've shown me that family is not about blood, but about heart." A year had passed since that fateful day at the church. The shelter, now called the New Dawn Foundation, had become a model of excellence in childcare. Success stories multiplied. Dozens of children had found loving families through the new programs implemented by Richard. The old basement, once a place of punishment, was now a cozy library where Michael often read stories to the younger children, transforming memories of pain into moments of joy. The mansion had also undergone a complete transformation. The spaces once filled with expensive and impersonal objects now overflowed with life and human warmth. Margaret's photographs had been replaced by precious moments between father and son, Michael blowing out the candles on his first birthday cake in their new home, the two of them laughing during an afternoon at the park, shared moments that were worth more than any material wealth. Richard discovered that his heart, once wounded by betrayal, had healed and expanded in a way he had never imagined possible. The success of the foundation attracted media attention and other institutions. Richard and Michael were often invited to share their story and inspire others to get involved in social causes. The boy who once barely dared to speak now expressed himself with surprising eloquence for his age, especially when it came to the importance of giving voice and protection to vulnerable children. "Sometimes the hero we need is within us," he would say during one of his speeches, making Richard swallow tears of pride. Nights of nightmares had been replaced by dreams of hope. Michael not only had his own room, but a true home filled with love and security. Richard, who once measured success by the numbers in his bank accounts, now measured it by the smiles of his son and the other children they helped. Together, they had created something much greater than a simple charity institution. They had built a place where dreams could blossom and broken hearts could heal. During the inauguration party for the foundation's new wing, Richard watched Michael playing with the other children in the newly built garden. The frightened boy who had entered his life on that fateful day now radiated happiness and confidence. "Dad," Michael called, running towards him with a radiant smile, "come see what we've built." Richard let himself be pulled by his son's small but firm hand, realizing that in the end, it hadn't been him who had saved Michael. They had saved each other. The sunset painted the sky with vibrant colors, creating a perfect backdrop for another day's end at the foundation. The laughter of children mingled with the sound of birds, creating a symphony of joy that echoed through the renovated halls. Richard hugged Michael, feeling the warmth and trust emanating from his small body. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching me the true meaning of family." Michael looked up, his eyes shining with love and wisdom beyond his years. "No, Dad. Thank you for showing me that sometimes we need to lose everything to find what truly matters." The foundation's lights turned on one by one, illuminating the path for all the children who still needed help. Richard's empire was no longer just about business. It was a legacy of love, hope, and transformation. And at the center of it all was Michael, the little hero who had turned a story of greed and betrayal into a tale of courage, redemption, and the transformative power of true love. Tomorrow will be even better, Richard thought, watching his son share toys with the other children, because now we know that true miracles happen when we open our hearts to love. The courtroom was packed on the day of the sentencing. Margaret, who once dazzled everyone with her elegance, now wore the orange prison uniform, her once perfectly styled hair now dull and unkempt. Her hands, which once flaunted expensive rings and perfectly manicured nails, were now handcuffed in her lap. The judge flipped through the case documents with a severe expression, each page revealing more details of the crimes she had committed against the shelter children and Richard's empire. Margaret Blake, the judge's voice echoed through the room. After careful review of the evidence presented, this court finds you guilty of all charges: embezzlement, child abuse, attempted premeditated homicide, forgery of documents. The list went on, each pronounced crime making Margaret shrink further in her chair. When the judge finally finished enumerating her crimes, the silence in the room was as heavy as lead. Margaret tried to maintain her haughty posture, but her hands visibly trembled. The sentence came down like a hammer. 20 years in prison, the judge announced, his voice laden with disdain, the first 10 of which will be served under maximum security. Furthermore, as part of your sentence, you will be required to perform community service in public shelters for the duration of your sentence. Margaret felt her blood run cold. Community service in shelters. It was as if fate was mocking her, forcing her to serve the very people she had despised and mistreated. The first day of her community service arrived like a nightmare come true. Escorted by guards, Margaret was taken to one of the city's largest public shelters. The smell of cheap disinfectant and institutional food hit her nostrils as soon as she crossed the doors, making her stomach churn. The shelter's director, a stocky woman with a stern expression, greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to your new job, Mrs. Blake. We don't have luxuries or privileges here. You're going to learn the true meaning of caring for children." A simple servant's uniform was handed to Margaret, a faded shirt and baggy pants that seemed to have been worn by hundreds of people before her. "Put this on," ordered the director, "and then come get your cleaning supplies." Margaret held the uniform by the tips of her fingers as if it was something contaminated. I can't wear my own clothes?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The director's laugh was cold and humorless. "Here you are no longer the wealthy bride who stole from innocent children. Here you are just another criminal paying for your crimes." The shelter staff, who had been informed of her arrival and crimes, watched with a mixture of disdain and vindictive satisfaction as Margaret changed from her prison clothes into the servant's uniform. Her last attempts to maintain any dignity crumbled when she was led to a cleaning supplies closet and given her first tasks: cleaning bathrooms, changing diapers, washing floors. "Start with the first floor bathrooms," instructed the director. "And remember, here you'll learn that every child you wronged is a precious human being, even if you have to learn it the hard way." The first month at the shelter was an exercise in constant humiliation for Margaret. The children, who had somehow learned who she was and what she had done, seemed determined to make her job as difficult as possible. When she finished cleaning a hallway, dozens of little muddy feet would purposefully run through it. After hours spent scrubbing bathrooms until they shone, someone would always accidentally knock over a bucket of dirty water on the floor. Her hands, once protected by silk gloves, were now rough and cracked from constant contact with cleaning products. During meals, her task was to clean the cafeteria tables and collect the food that fell on the floor. The children seemed especially inspired during these moments. Porridge was accidentally spilled, milk was unintentionally poured, and cookies were crushed under their small but determined feet. "Oops, sorry," they would say with smiles that didn't hide their satisfaction at seeing her on her knees, picking up the scraps with her own hands. Margaret bit her lip to keep from crying, bitterly remembering how she used to treat these same children when she was in power. The nursery was particularly challenging. The babies seemed to choose exactly the moments when she was changing their diapers to have the most disastrous accidents. "I think little Pedro ate something that didn't agree with him," commented one of the staff with false concern, handing Margaret a particularly active baby that day. The smell was unbearable, and when she finally managed to clean everything, she discovered that her once perfectly manicured nails were completely ruined, even through the rubber gloves. The nights were dedicated to heavy cleaning, scrubbing bathrooms, mopping floors, disinfecting surfaces. Margaret discovered muscles she didn't even know existed, each one aching in different ways. One night, as she was scrubbing particularly stubborn stains from the bathroom floor, she heard giggles coming from the doorway. A group of older children was there, watching her work. "Hey, Auntie," called out one of them with false sweetness. "I think you missed a spot over there." As Margaret turned to look, a cascade of grape juice was purposefully spilled on the floor she had just cleaned. The shelter staff did nothing to stop the children's pranks. In fact, Margaret often caught them hiding smiles whenever something particularly humiliating happened to her. "Consider it a lesson in humility," the director told her one day, after Margaret had been accidentally doused in porridge during breakfast. "Every mess you clean, every diaper you change, every humiliation you swallow, it's just a fraction of the suffering you caused these children." Her only breaks were for her own meals, served at an isolated table in the corner of the cafeteria. The food was the same she had once considered too good for the shelter children: watery porridge, stale bread, flavorless soup. Every bite was a bitter reminder of her past cruelty. "How's lunch, Mrs. Margaret?" asked one of the cooks with barely disguised sarcasm. "Still think it's a waste of money to provide decent food for the children." The hardest part of the day was when parents came to visit or adopt the children. Margaret was forced to clean the visitation room, listening to the happy laughter and conversations as she worked. Sometimes she recognized faces from high society, people who used to treat her as an equal, who had attended her almost wedding. Now they pretended not to see her, turning their faces away as she shuffled past dragging buckets and brooms, her uniform stained and her hair tied in an unglamorous hairnet. One afternoon, while cleaning the windows of the main room, Margaret saw a luxury car park in front of the shelter. Her heart stopped when she recognized Richard getting out of the vehicle, helping Michael get out. The two were carrying bags of gifts and toys for the children. Desperate not to be seen, Margaret tried to hide behind a curtain, but the director had other plans. "Mrs. Blake," she called out loudly, "the floor needs to be cleaned now. The children are going to have a special party." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she was forced to kneel and start scrubbing the floor, practically at the feet of her ex-fiancé and the child who had ruined her plans. The day always ended in the same humiliating way. Margaret was forced to clean the bathrooms one last time before returning to prison. On that particular night, as she scrubbed away particularly stubborn stains from the floor, her tears mingled with the dirty water. Her hands, once dedicated only to counting stolen money and displaying expensive jewelry, were now red and calloused. Her reflection in the tile showed an unrecognizable woman. There was no trace left of the elegant Margaret, who had once dreamed of becoming Mrs. Coleman. In her place was only a criminal serving her sentence in the most degrading way possible. The guards escorting her back to prison seemed to take special pleasure in commenting on her day. "How was work today, Blake?" they would ask with ironic smiles. "How many diapers did you change? How much vomit did you clean up?" Margaret kept her head down, but she could hear the laughter of the other inmates as she passed through the prison corridor. News of her community service had spread quickly, and her daily humiliation was a source of amusement for everyone. Lying in her cell at night, Margaret stared at the stained ceiling, aware that this was only the beginning. She still had years ahead of community service, years of daily humiliation, years of cleaning the filth she had once sworn she was above touching. The contrast between her former life and her current one was like a cruel joke of fate. From designer clothes to a faded uniform, from dinners at expensive restaurants to institutional food leftovers, from the status of a wealthy bride-to-be to a shelter servant. An old photo had fallen from her pocket during the day, one of the few possessions she still had. In it, Margaret was stunning in her wedding dress, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed she had the world at her feet. Now looking at that image, she barely recognized the woman in the photograph. Her hands trembled as she tore the photo into tiny pieces, each fragment representing a shattered dream, a frustrated ambition, a humiliation she would have to endure for years to come. Margaret's last thought before falling asleep was always the same, the cruel irony of her fate. She who had despised and mistreated innocent children was now condemned to serve them in the most humble way possible. Her world, once filled with luxury and power, had been reduced to an endless cycle of humiliations and degrading work. Each morning brought with it the same ruthless routine, waking up before sunrise, putting on the stained uniform that now defined her existence, and preparing herself for another day of constant degradation. What tormented her the most was not just the physical tasks, no matter how repugnant they were. It was the complete loss of her former identity. The people who passed her in the corridors of the shelter no longer saw the elegant and powerful Margaret. They saw only another criminal serving her sentence, a servant whose only purpose was to clean up after others. Her hands, once symbols of refinement with expensive rings and perfectly manicured nails, were now permanently stained by cleaning products, with calluses that told the story of her downfall. Each task was a cruel reminder of her crimes, each humiliation a payment for her past cruelty. When a child accidentally spilled food on the floor she had just cleaned, Margaret was forced to remember how many times she had denied proper meals to the little ones in the shelter she had run. When she had to clean up vomit and change soiled diapers, she recalled the times she had ignored the basic needs of the children in her care. It was as if the universe had devised the perfect punishment to turn the tormentor into a servant of those she had once despised. The worst of all was knowing that this would be her fate for many, many years. Cleaning filth, changing diapers, being humiliated by those she had once considered inferior. There was no escape, no shortcuts. Every attempt to maintain a shred of her former dignity was methodically destroyed by the reality of her new position. The dreams of power and wealth that had once motivated her were now replaced by much more basic goals. Making it through the day without crying, enduring yet another humiliation without completely breaking down. Her empire of lies had turned into a sentence of servitude, and there was nothing she could do but accept her new reality. The nights in her cell were filled with tormenting memories of her former life. The dinners at expensive restaurants, the jewelry, the designer dresses, the respect and admiration she had once commanded. Now all that remained were the stains on her uniform, the persistent smell of cleaning products on her skin, and the certainty that each new day would bring with it new forms of humiliation. The most ironic part was that, after so long despising honest work and manipulating others for her own benefit, Margaret was now being forced to experience firsthand the value of hard work, even if in the most degrading way possible. Her house of cards had collapsed, and she was destined to spend the next few years picking up the debris of her own unbridled ambition, one mop bucket at a time. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now, you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.